Buenas tardes, good afternoon. Dear all, good afternoon and welcome to this event organized by Barcelona Centre Financer for Sustainability. As the chairman, it gives me a great pleasure to stand before you today on this important occasion to discuss a topic of utmost significance, biodiversity and the relation with financial sustainability. First of all, let me express my gratitude to all of you joining us to the Barcelona Stock Exchange Auditorium. Let me to thank to the Barcelona Stock Exchange, associate of Barcelona Centre Financer, once more for to welcome us, and this has been always in the past. This event, which is a follow-up of our first one, done virtually on May 2022, with the participation of Mark Hale, that today will be the keynote speaker, gave us the feeling of how important is and will be the connection between the biodiversity and sustainable finance. And today, this is the result of our efforts to make this event possible. Let me make some considerations about the relationship between biodiversity and sustainable finance. Biodiversity is the remarkable variety of life on Earth. It's the foundation of our planet's ecological balance. From the tiniest microorganisms to the largest mammals, every species contributes to the intricate web of life, providing us with essential ecosystem services such as clean air, water, and food security. Yet, in recent decades, human activities have accelerated the loss of biodiversity at an alarming rate. Deforestation, habitat destruction, pollution, and climate change are all factors contributing to this crisis. The consequences are far-reaching and affect us of all. Loss of biodiversity that make on risk not only the delicate ecosystem, but also our economies, health, and well-being. Therefore, it is imperative that we act now to reverse this trend and safeguard our planet for future generations. From the financial sector, we have a unique opportunity to make a substantial impact by integrating sustainability into our business practices and investment decisions. We can drive positive change and support initiatives that promote biodiversity conservation. Through responsible investment and green financing, we can encourage the adoption of sustainable practices across industries, encouraging a more harmonious relationship between human development and nature. Going to the development of the event, our estimate keynote speaker for today's event is Mr. Mark Hale, a renowned environmentalist and expert in biodiversity conservation. Very briefly, the most significant aspect of his professional career are he has devoted his entire career to environment and sustainable development, beginning with 5 years in the United Nations Environment Programme. He spent 4 years in Worldwide Fund International Conservation Division, with responsibility for building this program in China. Also, he has been a conservation advisor to His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. They followed with 14 years at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Also, when he left the IUCN to establish the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Europe, when he directed until her retirement in 2016, and where he remains a senior fellow. Mark was a senior advisor to the United Nations Environment Programme in carrying to the design of a sustainable finance systems for the 4 years on its mandate, taking special responsibility for developing countries. He helped establish and is senior advisor to the International Network of Financial Centers for Sustainability, FC4S, where he led on development of the FC4S program for Africa and the emerging program on biodiversity finance. Mark is chairman of the board of Traffic International, the world's leading wildlife trade organization. He sits on the board of Sustainable Finance Geneva. Mark reads and lectures on the subject of sustainable development. He's a founder of the Geneva 2030 Ecosystem, a platform for dialogue and cooperation about the challenge of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. With his intensive knowledge and experience, Mr. Hale will shed light on the current state of biodiversity and the urgent need for action. His insights will inspire us to all recognize the value of our natural world and encourage us to work collectively towards its preservation. Following Mr. Hall's address, we will have the privilege of engaging in two-panel discussion that will provide us with diverse perspectives on the issue at hand. Our esteemed panelists comprise external scientists, finance and institution experts, policymakers, and environmental advocates who have dedicated an important part of their professional careers defending the cause of biodiversity conservation. Together, we will expose initiative solutions and strategies to mitigate the challenge posed by diversity loss. Today's discussion will provide a platform to exchange ideas, share best practices, and form partnerships. Let us seize this opportunity to collaborate, brainstorm, and develop actionable strategies that will ensure the preservation of biodiversity becomes a priority for governments, businesses, and individuals alike. Before to give the floor to Mr. Halle, let me remember that attendance at the conference is valid for 2 hours of training for the recertification of EIA, EIP, FA, FP, ESG advisor. During this week, you will receive the test to validate the hours. Thank you all for being here today, and I wish you fruitful derivation and productive conversation. Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Luis, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for coming here. As you can see, the title of my presentation is Biodiversity, the New Frontier for Sustainable Finance. And I hope you will leave here convinced that I'm right in saying that it is the new frontier. It's a frontier that presents challenges, but it's also a frontier that presents amazing opportunities. And I hope that we will come away from here thinking not so much, oh my goodness, everything's going down the drain, what can we do? But think, actually, there's so much happening, there's so much innovation, there's so many opportunities to do good in this area that you'll leave here motivated and excited about the possibilities in your own areas of work. Now, Luis described my long career. You will have noticed that the first half of my career was dedicated to nature conservation. But the second half of my career was dedicated to reform of economic policy with the purpose of aligning it better with sustainable development. So what I'd like to do with nature finance, with biodiversity finance, is bring those two components together. Because I'm convinced that with the best will in the world, biodiversity cannot be saved unless we realign the financial system to the needs of ecosystem management and biodiversity restoration. So that's my thesis in starting. What most people do when speaking about biodiversity is to try and scare you by saying, oh my goodness, things are terrible, things are going down the drain, if we don't do something, the world's going to come to an end, and that picture is a fairly accurate one. What I want to do is convince you of something else, and that is nature is inseparable from economic activity. And that if we fail to incorporate nature in the right way into economic activity, then that economic activity is at risk as well. And people say, well, lots of production is dependent on access to natural resources. I would say that 100% of global GDP is 100% dependent on nature. Whether directly or indirectly, all of it depends on nature, depending how you define it. Now, anybody can come up with a very long list of the dangers that we are facing, that the current situation, that 50% of global crops are at risk from soil erosion, or that 420 million hectares worldwide were lost to deforestation in the 30 years that ended in 2020. We all know this. All of us have access to these statistics. All of us hear them all the time. And they disturb us, and they should disturb us. They give us this sense that out there somewhere, not very far away, we are facing something that's quite grim. But we still tend to focus on the immediate priorities. So, wash your hands and you'll survive the COVID epidemic, when Behind the COVID epidemic is the risk of recession, behind that is climate change, and behind that is nature collapse. We have to remember that vertebrates have declined by 68% since 1970, that 90% of the world's large fish have disappeared, that 1 million species are at risk today. And if you look at the words of the Intergovernmental IPBES, it says that biodiversity is being degraded faster than at any other point in human history. This is significant. In 1992, we adopted the Biodiversity Convention. It was supposed to address this question, and yet today, 30 years later, 31 years later, biodiversity is being lost at an unprecedented rate. So we have given ourselves the instruments, but we haven't used them properly. And it's not that this is a mystery to anybody. All of you know this. You know it because you're experts in this field, but everybody knows it. There isn't a day that goes by when the newspapers aren't telling us about the crisis for water. You've just been through a major drought in Catalonia. You know this. You see it every day. And so the question is there something we can do about it? Well, I think that we ought to look at the risks together with the opportunities. So the World Economic Forum, hardly a sort of radical left-wing organization, estimates that 44 trillion of global output is at risk due to the decline of the world's ecosystem. $44 trillion. When you compare that to the amounts needed to correct the biodiversity loss question, you realize that it's many, many, many times bigger. But at the same time, you could look at it from the other side, that the opportunities for investing in biodiversity are enormous. And I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation when talking about nature markets. The WEF estimates that there's opportunities worth 10 trillion, and that could provide 395 million jobs globally simply by addressing the nature challenge. And it's not as if nothing is happening. It's not as if we're sitting here wringing our hands and saying, my goodness, what do we do? Everything's going terrible. A great deal is happening. We've just come out of COP15 of the Global Biodiversity Convention. We adopted an ambitious global biodiversity framework. And I've been to a number of these things. What was special about Montreal is that there were over 400 members of the financial community there. There were several events dedicated to financing biodiversity or the impact of the financial system on biodiversity and the requirements for reform of that system to meet our biodiversity goals. The funds are popping up all over the place. The U.S. has created an international conservation fund. The Amazon fund is reaching billions in assets. The Global Environment Facility was recently renewed at a much higher rate than ever before. So we are responding. I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January of this year, and fully 100 of the roughly 400 events held during that forum were related to nature, and many of them related to nature finance. So the world is waking up. It's not a question of saying we don't know what to do. We'll just go, play golf or go on holiday. We are waking up. The True Cost has just come out with a report on natural capital at risk, and they estimate that the unpriced natural capital costs are at 7.3 trillion per annum, equivalent to 13% of global output. So we're talking about, and the impact is different in different sectors. The worst, coal power generation in Eastern Asia, but you can see that from that graph that we know in some detail the impact of natural capital loss on economic activity and output. So it's not as if we're navigating in the dark. We're navigating increasingly with very reliable figures and approaches. Now, people will tell you, yeah, I know biodiversity is important, but right now we're dealing with climate change. We're worried about climate change. We're taking action in our banks, putting in climate policies. We're doing all of these things. And we'll deal with nature later. We don't have the bandwidth. We don't have the capacity. But in fact, it's increasingly clear that you absolutely cannot deal with them separately. You have to deal with them together, or you don't deal with either of them well. And so this is a graphic that shows how not only the relations take place, but how the feedback loops are extraordinarily important. I would say that the most promising way of addressing climate change is through nature action. And that the most promising way of dealing with biodiversity loss is to address climate mitigation and adaptation. They go together along with the sort of human equity side of things. If we try and pick them apart, do them differently, do them sequentially, we will fail probably at all of them. And it's actually clear when you look at it, that if you look at the potential of greenhouse gas CO2 equivalent reduction by sector, you'll see that agriculture, forestry, and land use is the most important of all of these. It is more important, has a greater potential than energy. And most people think, oh, well, if we want to solve climate change, we better go to renewable energy, we better make our buildings more energy efficient. Yes, we should do all of that. But the real prize is action on nature. The real prize is action on ecosystems. And that is something that has not yet made it into the general understanding. So if you're dealing with climate change and you're not dealing with biodiversity and nature, you're missing the trick. You're missing the boat, and you're probably taking actions that won't succeed too well. But, you know, this is a message that's getting through. This, adapted from TNFD work, shows that everybody sort of gets it now. Everybody in each economic category gets that this is the challenge, and more they are moving towards the right, towards action that at least assesses the risks and dangers, and where possible, ideally starts to integrate them in decision making. So companies are looking for increased regulation. They are sensitive more and more to consumer, public, and NGO pressures. Look at investors, they're beginning to try and figure out how to incorporate nature-related financial risk, how they can identify and follow opportunities at nature-positive investment. They're looking at the climate-nature nexus. If you look at governments and policymakers, particularly with the boost given in Montreal with the COP15 agreement, they are also now looking at nature action as a form of security for the future of their populations. And right across the spectrum of regulators and standard bodies, we're now looking at how we can assess risk, how we can protect consumers, how we can bring about a kind of global alignment around a nature-positive form of development that we can share with the others. So if we look forward towards 2030, some of those sectors are closer, some are farther, but they're all moving in that direction. Why does it matter? Because right now, the financial system is not supporting either climate change or biodiversity restoration. If you look at the expenditures on nature-positive activities, and I say nature-positive activities and not nature conservation, because nature-positive activities span a much bigger spectrum than those related simply to conservation. But the world in 2019 spent between 124 and 143 billion per year on activities that benefit nature worldwide. And this is a tripling of the financial resources devoted to conservation, devoted to nature since 2012. So the trends are actually very encouraging, very positive. At the same time, if you want to look at the other side of the coin, what you find is that annual government spending on subsidies that degrade nature is 4 times as high as the total funding on activities that benefit nature. So we still have a completely skewed system. The same is true in the climate area. The total amount of money spent last year on combating climate change is $634 billion. We spent about $825 billion subsidizing carbon-based fuels. So on the one hand, we're doing more. On the other hand, we're continuing to do things that invalidate and undermine the results of what we're doing. We estimate that the total annual need is about $1 billion. And if you remember how our governments responded to COVID, it's not an absolute question of money. It's a decision on how you allocate the money. But the great majority of the funds that are needed for biodiversity are withdrawal of funding from things that are damaging nature rather than putting money directly into nature conservation and restoration. You need both of them. But if you're giving with the right hand and taking away from the left hand, you haven't achieved the result that you want. This is a bit of a breakdown of global spending on nature. You'll see it's quite varied. A lot has to do with finance, green financial products or carbon markets and nature offset markets. They are all part of the mix. But what we really need is to stop doing harm rather than just doing more good. So what are we actually doing about it? What's happening that is going to lead to a major change? And I think probably the single most important thing that's happening right now is the progress being made by the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which in September of this year will launch its framework. So it's a framework for reporting on nature-related risk, impact, and dependency. It's a way of measuring or helping companies and financial institutions to measure risk. And even, as you can see, Goldman Sachs believes that the implementation of TNFD will enhance biodiversity-related reporting with implications for cost of capital and brand reputation. So in a sense, TNFD is emerging as a kind of new standard of transparency, of access to data, of access by investors to an understanding of how your company is performing in this area, and therefore opens the door to, I think, some very strong further pressure on companies to move across the curve into nature-positive production. And TNFD is just one example. The whole area of standards and regulations is developing very quickly. The IFRS has standards on corporate disclosure, ratings, and financial stability. The EU, as you all know, but also matched in the UK and the US, are looking for new guarantees on due diligence, for example, on zero deforestation in value chains. There are credit markets emerging in the nature area, private certification, peer-to-peer certification, national regulations emerging in Australia. And then in terms of addressing illegal financial activity, a great deal more pressure on extending the use of anti-money laundering rules to ensure that they address illegal activity related to nature and its products. So you have a whole world of standards, a whole sort of infrastructure of standards and regulations that are beginning to gather pace behind the lead showed by TNFD. Of course, if you talk to most financial actors, they'll say, yeah, I know nature is very important, biodiversity is very important. We would like to take it into account. But, the data isn't there. We just don't have the data. We don't know how to do it because the data's all over the place. It's scattered. There's no standards for the data. They're not comparable. Some of them are out of date. It's very hard to test their quality. And I think that was true a few years ago. But what you will find is that, as I say, Credit Suisse, that famous unsuccessful Swiss bank, found that 70% of investors believe that lack of data is the key barrier to making investments supporting biodiversity. But what you'll find is that there's a whole series of developments around data, giving access to data, regularizing data. And of course, with TNFD, there will be an avalanche of new data available that has to fit into these structures. And you see at the bottom of that slide, there are a series of initiatives. You're probably familiar with the Encore tool of UNEP-FI, but Global Biodiversity Score launched by the CDC Biodiversity in France, and lots of new commercial players coming up and offering services around biodiversity data. So Nature Alpha, the one that I mentioned there, starts not with, here's the data, good luck. They start with trying to understand what kind of data and in what form can be picked up by banks or companies and introduced into their models directly. So they figure that people want the data, but they're not prepared to do a huge amount of work to use that data. The more you make it user-friendly, the more you make it adaptable to their systems, the more likely they are to use it, and therefore to start measuring and managing nature-related risk. So in the data area, yes, there is a challenge. TNFD will go a long way to meeting that challenge, and there is a whole explosion of innovative approaches to address the data challenge, so that I think we will look back a few years from now and say, yeah, data used to be a big problem. It isn't anymore. And then if you look at regulators, you know, the Dutch central bank, the Nederlandse Bank, is the Dutch central bank. They looked at the information on nature risk in Dutch companies and financial institutions, and they reported that 36% of investments of Dutch financial institutions are highly or very highly dependent on one or more ecosystem service, which means that if there is a risk to that big a proportion of financial activity in your country, it means that the risk is no longer the risk of an institution or a group of institutions. It begins to become a prudential risk, and therefore falls within the mandate of central banks and financial regulators. So what you're seeing now is that the central banks, the financial regulators, are looking at nature risk as something that is a threat to the economy as a whole. Not the threat to Credit Suisse, not the threat to a particular company, but a threat to the financial system that they have a responsibility to manage. And so what way are we going forward? I think that the problem, as I said before, is that the data is available, but it's not necessarily available in a form that you can use. It isn't investment grade. The big advantage with biodiversity data is that most of it is in the public domain. The disadvantage is that it's in rough form, it's unused, it's like raw ore from a mine that you can't make a fork out of or you can't make a product out of. It's there, but there's no means of translating it. So some people are looking at how you make that translation service, how you can take raw data onto an open source platform and transform it into the kind of data that a financial decision maker, a financial manager needs to use. So the financial centers here, I think, have a very important role to play in looking at the requirements of their members for this kind of data, and also ensuring that mechanisms are available, or at least they can point you to initiatives that are trying to take this data and use it in a way that will allow you to measure environmental risk. The second development in this area, and what I'm describing to you now, are the sort of planks of a foundation on which we can build an adequate system of environmental risk management or nature risk management. This is a tool that I'm involved in the development of that looks both at financial flows in the private sector and those in the public sector, puts them through an alignment tool, and ends up with a rating on a dashboard. And what it does is to say, if you take the goal D from the Global Biodiversity Framework, looking for the importance of mainstreaming alignment of financial flows with nature, if you take the Global Biodiversity Framework as the goal, as the reference, as a framework you want to adapt to, it asks the question, how are your finances aligned with that goal? So if you're an investor, you're investing in 20 or 30 different things, how well aligned are those investments with the requirements of the Global Biodiversity Framework? Or if you're the city of Barcelona, or if you're the government of Catalonia, how well is your public budget aligning with the GBF? And the advantage of this tool, which is simply in development now, we're piloting it in Gabon, and we're piloting it with a Brazilian bank. So we have a public and a private sector pilot underway, is that it will show you not only your overall rating, but it'll show you where your alignment is strong and where it is weak. So it gives you, in a sense, a roadmap for saying, oh gosh, those 3 or 4 areas that we have still in the red, we need to bring them across so that ideally, at the end, what you have is a portfolio that is entirely aligned with the GBF and therefore entirely nature positive, which is where we want to get to in the end. We were talking earlier at lunch about the graphic indication of the goals from Montreal in December. We know that we've been going downhill, so to speak. We have a possibility of turning things around so that by 2030 there is no net loss of biodiversity, and that by 2050 we have full recovery. So the first is to stop the ongoing destruction of nature to the point where you're at least at nature neutrality, and then start rebuilding with all the efforts that go into ecological restoration, recovery, new processes that build on on what nature can offer that restore ecosystems and so on. So this is the goal of where we want to go. And I say goal because so many things are happening that if we don't have a sort of magnetic north, if we don't have a way of saying, all these things, they have to lead here. This is where we have to get to. And this is a graphic, in a sense, based on the Global Biodiversity Framework. But I think what we are headed for is a new norm, which we call nature positive. Now, nature positive is, if you like, the biodiversity equivalent of net zero in the climate area. That you want all activity, all financial activity, not only to be nature neutral, but because of all the destruction we've already achieved, that you want it to actually be restorative. You want the result of financial activity to leave nature in a better shape than it was before. You want, if you're going into an extractive industry, that at the end of the process you come out with nature better off than when you started. So the nature positive goal, we see as a kind of new social norm. We would like to establish it as a new social norm so that a company that destroys nature in the course of its activities begins to lose its reputation, begins to lose its clients, begins to lose its social license to operate. And so we want to put pressure on companies to adopt some kind of a nature positive model, particularly in the areas of food, land use, ocean use, infrastructure, and energy, where the greatest gains can be made in the shortest amount of time, and get to the point where a net zero nature positive approach, obligation, becomes a sort of framework within which all economic activity takes place. The planetary boundaries, and we're exceeding the planetary boundaries. The idea is to bring production finance back within those planetary boundaries, and above, of course, the social floor represented by the donut. And a lot of things are happening in that respect. We understand now that we need to reduce and eliminate public subsidies that are harmful for nature. This is your own taxpayer money undermining the earth. And it's really intolerable and shouldn't be accepted. And so we need a strict scrutiny of these little deals that are made by politicians to ensure that the net result is not harming nature. We need to extend legal liability for environmental damage not only to the company, but to those who finance the company. So that if you're funding a mine in Brazil and the mine has a terrible toxic spill that kills lots of people, it shouldn't be the mining company alone that's liable. That liability should be shared also with the financial. There's huge progress now on recognizing the legal personhood or the legal standing of nature in courts of law. And even, for example, a couple companies who have put a representative of nature on their corporate boards. And so there's a great deal of experimentation in the legal area. We're seeing an explosion of litigation, mainly around climate, but increasingly also about nature, where an NGO can attack a company, it can attack a government, saying you're not meeting the provisions of the laws that you yourself adopted, and forcing the governments to go back and put up stricter standards. And I mentioned earlier the UK's due diligence requirement on deforestation-free value chains for any UK company. So it's not as if we're sitting here wringing our hands. We are doing things that will eventually make a nature positive norm, I think, possible. We all know that biodiversity risk is much more difficult, much more complex to deal with than climate risk. There isn't a simple metric like greenhouse gases or carbon that you can apply to financial transactions. So we need to just get good at doing what we have to do. But I think it is possible to press for such action as banks no longer giving credit to companies that don't commit to a nature positive norm. Governments excluding companies that don't commit to a nature positive norm from participating in public procurement competitions and that kind of thing. So there are lots of ways in which we can speed up this movement. Now, we tend to talk about nature as a risk, as a danger, as something to be managed, something to be handled, preventing the worst effects of what's happening out there. But we underestimate the extent to which nature is also an extraordinary opportunity. And I'm among those who believe that we cannot succeed in the long term by tinkering around at the edges of our financial system. That, in fact, unless we transform the way that finance operates, the financial system works, we're not going to succeed. This is not something that can be done in a linear fashion, that we extend the good news or the good trends that we've seen out another 10 or 15 years and things will begin to come right. I actually believe that we need a fundamental rethink of our economic system, of the way our economies work, which doesn't mean that we go into degrowth or throw everything out or try some crazy political ideology, but it does mean questioning much more deeply what it is that we're doing and what effect it's likely to have. And if you look at nature markets, people tend to think of nature markets as using products from the jungle or herbal teas or herbal medicine, and there's a niche market for nature products that is cute, that makes people feel good. You can have a picture of some Amazon indigenous person on the cover, and you're doing great things. We see nature markets as new markets for any kind of product or service that leads to a nature positive outcome. So it doesn't have to be products based on nature. It doesn't have to be, wood, certified wood or legal fisheries or whatever. It could be almost any good or service that moves us across that spectrum from environmentally destructive performance over to performance which is nature positive. And we think that there's something going on now which is an absolutely unprecedented pivot to nature being valued and traded and generating a whole series of new value chains and products and revenue streams based on respect for nature, based on approaches that stay within environmental limits, but in a way that grows new markets out of the opportunities that exist today. And so we talk about credit markets, biodiversity credits, nature credits, whatever you want to call them. There is a massive interest. There are people tripping over each other to present biodiversity credits out there in the market. And it's probable that there will be very large-scale biodiversity credit markets in the future. They're financial derivatives that reflect ecosystem service values that are emerging. We are seeing the way in which nature is being regarded by the markets as changing fundamentally. And perhaps the biggest examples lie in the area of food and farming. If you look seriously at the case, we have a food system that only operates because we are pricing nature externalities at zero. If we were pricing them properly, the entire industrialized food system of the world would collapse immediately. And I'll give you a figure on that I think in the next slide. But what you're also seeing is the rate of growth in the alternatives. So in the food system, vertical farming operations and technologies are growing by 22% a year. So are markets for alternative meat, dairy, and plant-based protein, the alt protein movement that is there. Plant-based and sustainable textiles growing at 13% a year. Sustainable plant-based packaging, 5% a year, and it's only just beginning. And there are whole other areas that have not developed in the same way. I mentioned nature-based offsets, including forest grasslands and soil, but also the regenerative farming technologies and methods, biofuels, and last of all, of course, the entire service industry that will surround all of these changes. What we're looking at, and this source is from McKinsey, so we're not talking about some wild NGO estimate. We're talking about markets that are moving way up in the hundreds of billions and are just beginning. So the investment opportunities for those who want to get behind new nature markets, I think, are absolutely obvious. Now, I don't want to present nature markets as the panacea, that abandon everything you're doing and go over to nature markets because they're fabulous opportunities, they're growing fast. We know that there are transition risks in moving to nature markets that are really quite important to understand and to manage. That if there are a lot of people who say that the market power of the rich countries, if it moves into nature markets, it gives them an advantage over terms of trade in nature-rich markets. We're seeing already the sort of resistance of countries like Brazil, who say, wait a minute, when people say that the Amazon is a remarkable resource that you're not using properly, and say, yeah, it's a remarkable resource, and it's our resource, and so we will deal with it the way we want to. There's always criticism of financializing nature. So if you give nature an economic value, you are, in a sense, underplaying and underselling the many other values that nature has. And we know this from our own culture, from our own upbringing, the love for nature, the aesthetic value of nature, the amenity value of nature, all of these things that people care about a great deal and that aren't easy to put into a financial formula. So we have to make sure that we move towards nature markets in a way that doesn't turn them into financial formulas that are then traded and built into models and remove any link between that and the genuine cultural and spiritual need that we all have for healthy nature. The market valuation of nature destabilizes vulnerable economies and can create food and employment insecurity, leading, of course, to restricted access to affordable capital, but also to the problems that we all know of outward migration of people who no longer have livelihood opportunities in their own country. And, of course, it deepens the opportunities for state and elite capture of nature rent at the cost of indigenous peoples and local communities. So please don't go away from here thinking that I've said nature markets are the solution, we can move to it tomorrow. There are a lot of challenges relating to that move, but it's a move that we need to make. And so if we look at that transition risk, it's important to realize that today the $8 trillion global food system is estimated to generate $12 trillion in negative externalities that are paid by others. That's what I said before, that if we valued nature in the food production system, it would be a bankrupt industry immediately. And so as we start understanding nature risk, as we start attributing a value to it so it can be managed, we need to understand that this has very deep consequences on the way our economies work at present, and that we need to be as conscious of the need to manage that transition well so that it doesn't backfire on us, as we are conscious of the opportunity of no longer allowing the food system to get away with 12 trillion of free services from nature. And of course, we all tend to think that the way the economy works is through legal companies, legal financial actors, trading, buying, selling, developing, innovating, and so on, and that is a big part of it. But there's a tendency to underestimate illegal financial markets. So forestry crime is estimated somewhere between $51 and $152 billion a year. Wildlife tracking between $7 and $22 billion a year. Illegal mining roughly in the same order of magnitude, if not bigger. Nature crimes are estimated to be worth $280 billion annually. And why is that possible? Because we are undervaluing nature and nature production, and therefore there is an opportunity to get something cheap and sell it at a higher price. And so the more we value nature, the more we bring it into the economic system, the less opportunity there will be to buy and flip something quickly, earning a very rapid profit. We also know that nature crimes drive much of nature's destruction through violence, through corruption, right throughout the value chain. So you can say in Brazil, they are cleaning, they're knocking down Amazon forest to produce beef and soy. Yes, but the wildlife there and the timber there go into illegal circuits, feed mafias, feed corruption, feed crime, and if you think about it, those resources end up within our formal financial system. So there's no way you can separate illegal nature markets from our wish to develop a legal business, but we need to ensure that we are transferring the risk and liability throughout the supply chain and not looking at it only at one point. And their efforts at increased traceability are making this possible. We would like to aim, and this is the purpose of nature positive outcomes, for the full elimination of nature crimes from investment value chains. So there should be a point at which no financial institution can support nature crimes, and that they know where they are occurring and they know how to eliminate them. So never think that the world is made up of a formal market of a certain value. It's also got that dark underside, which is a very important part of it, and also a very important part of the challenge for nature. So I would like to just end by giving you a few other areas where things are happening very fast. So we have seen recently, I think, that there's a new wave in debt for nature swaps, that a country agrees to invest in nature protection, and as a reward, they're given a reduction of their debt, or a certain part of their debt is written off. That's what we call debt for nature swaps. But we are actually looking at a far more ambitious instrument, which we call sustainability-linked sovereign debt instruments, where a government borrows money on the capital markets in exchange for meeting certain performance requirements. So let's say the country agrees to revegetate 1,000 square kilometers of degraded land, and that's their performance requirement. If they meet their performance requirement, they get their money at a lower cost than is available on general capital markets. And the cost of meeting that performance is generally no more than 5-10% of the value of the bond. The rest goes into the public purse and is allocated through the parliamentary budget process. Now, what does that do? Not only it gives countries that have very difficult access to capital that access in exchange for a nature performance. It could be a climate performance, it could be almost anything. But by investing in nature capital or investing in climate change action, they lower the perceived risk of the country on international debt markets and therefore improve the cost of capital. So what you're doing is, in a sense, generating a win-win situation where the country suddenly gets access to capital on beneficial terms in exchange for investment in natural capital, which in any case is good for them in the long term. So we're toying with that kind of instrument. Two of them were issued last year, one in Chile on renewable energy, which raised $2.6 billion, and one in Uruguay on forestry, where they raised 1.6, I think it was. The interesting thing is that those bond issues sold out within half an hour, each of them. They were put on the market, sold out in half an hour. They were oversubscribed 4 times. So there's clearly an interest in doing this, partly because we know that some of these countries will never pay back their debt. So we can go through the game of restructuring the debt and putting off the payment by another 10 years or 30 years. We all know it's not going to be paid. And so if you can eliminate it by a mutual commitment to address nature and climate priorities in exchange for better terms of capital, you've got a win-win situation. I think that I mentioned earlier that there is a movement now on the part of financial regulators and central banks. The NGFS, the group that brings them together around sustainable finance, now has something like 80 or 90 members. They're all central banks and financial regulators at the level of countries, and they are examining the extent to which nature destruction presents a prudential risk, and therefore is part of the mandate of central banks and financial regulators. That, if something is going to lead to Credit Suisse collapsing, okay, fine, that's their problem. If it's going to lead to your national economy collapsing or your currency collapsing, or excluding yourself from access to capital markets, it's a prudential matter. and therefore the business of central banks. And as central banks start looking at it, they say, what can we do with monetary policy tools? What can we do with those instruments in our mandate that will encourage the economy to take this seriously and therefore lower the prudential risk that they're currently facing? And of course, we are looking at all sorts of applications of technology. I mentioned there the Australian water credits market, which is a purely peer-to-peer water trading platform based on blockchain technology. So it tracks water wherever it goes within the economy. It tracks water trade, it tracks water use, and sets up a kind of marketplace where you can manage that water against agreed criteria in a way that doesn't require massive government decision making. It doesn't require putting institutions in place. It's a pure peer-to-peer blockchain-based platform for water trading. And we're seeing more and more of that kind of thing. The development of biodiversity credit markets is just exploding. It's just exploding. We try and track it. We can't begin to track it. There are so many initiatives everywhere in the private sector and the public sector. World Economic Forum is on it. The UNDP is on it. Everybody is on this thing. And what we're trying to do is to ensure that we learn the lessons from the failure of carbon markets, carbon credit markets, where essentially what happened is that the market was created before any governance infrastructure was put in place, and therefore it was dominated by the cowboys and the vultures who came in and distributed the spoils. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen, so that use of credits or even offsets in nature markets is not discredited from the beginning by poor governance and poor behavior. So where are we going from here? I'll give you my view of what I think is happening. The first is that the pace at which nature-related financial solutions are being developed is accelerating enormously. It was not many years ago, 5 years ago, I guess, I went to talk to the board of a group of Swiss private banks who invited me to lunch and asked me to talk about sustainable finance. And I said, look, sustainable finance is coming. I actually think it's here to stay, that this is not a fashion. It's not a passing thing. I don't even think it's mainstream. I think sustainable finance is the new stream. That we're not going to take sustainability and introduce it to our financial system. We're going to change the financial system so it meets the requirements of sustainability. And they sort of patted me on the back and said, oh, yeah, this is as if I was selling Girl Scout cookies or something. Yes, thanks, Mark. Yeah, we'll think about it. And now these people are tripping over each other to put in place systems related to climate and nature finance. So the speed at which this is going, and I think it's just the beginning, is something very impressive. Secondly, of course, we're talking about scale. Debt for nature swaps. 100 million was raised for the Belize Reef. Great. Took 9 years. It was very, very complicated to do. It's a once-off transaction that doesn't scale. What I was talking about before, which is the sustainability-linked sovereign bonds, there's no limit to the scale it can go to, or the limit is the country's indebtedness. And so you can talk, in Brazil, we're talking now with the Lula government about an initiative for their G20 presidency that starts on the 1st of December of this year, of a sovereign bond of something like $100 billion for the Amazon, where the sort of grant component or the credit enhancement component comes from the Amazon fund that already exists. So the debt instrument becomes a way of multiplying many times over the funding available. And let there be no doubt that even would hardly scratch the surface of the Amazon's problem. So we're looking at scale. I think we're changing social expectations. I think there's going to be less and less tolerance for companies or financial actors that destroy nature or destroy the climate in the course of generating a profit. I think there's going to be a consumer reaction against that. I think there's going to be a client reaction against that. I think the pressure on these companies to perform, particularly now that TNFD is going to be widely available and used, is going to grow enormously. And so that just the reputational risk factor of continuing the way they were doing before, I think is going to mean that they will either go out of business or adapt. And finally, I don't know how many of you have looked at Earth for All, which is the last report of the Club of Rome. What they did was to look at a series of scenarios. One was business as usual. So our current practices go on, to 2050, and what happens? And the other extreme was we reach planetary stability by 2050, that we have come back inside the bounds of planetary limits. We are addressing the equity issues. In fact, in that scenario, they talk about equity as a pathway to sustainable development. That not only can development not be sustainable unless we address the huge inequities on our planet, but addressing those inequities is probably the best way of getting positive nature and climate results. So look at those scenarios. And then they looked at 4 in between. There were variants on business as usual, variants on stability by 2050. And actually they came to the conclusion there are only 2 scenarios. There are only 2 scenarios. There's one that gets us to planetary stability in 2050 and the others that don't. And quite simply, if we don't choose the one that brings us to planetary stability, we might as well choose business as usual because it's going to lead to the same result over time. And so I think we're at a moment where we're really pivoting, we're really flexing. What encourages me more than anything, and I devoted a lot of my presentation to it, is we're putting together the instruments, the pieces, because in the end it's a practical question. If you're a bank manager, you need to know how to address a particular loan, how to address a particular problem. It's no good to say, well, we really ought to integrate biodiversity into our bank's actions. Everybody knows that. It's how you do it. And are the instruments there to make it possible? And I think that coming back and closing with the Financial Centers Network, what we see with Barcelona, but what we see with our 39 members, is an enormous shared interest in how to do this. What to do, they know. Why we're doing it, they know. What happens if we don't do it, they know. What they want is to say, how did Paris deal with this problem? Or did Luxembourg try something and did it work? And can we learn from that? Can we adapt to something that was done in Paris or in Frankfurt? And I think that pooling that knowledge, identifying best practice, mutual encouragement, because we're all sort of feeling around in the dark with this stuff, and me as much as anybody else. Don't get the impression that I'm a great expert who knows exactly what to do. This is a new area. This is an area that 3 or 4 years ago was one of these things where most reactions I got were, oh, please don't bother me, I'm dealing with climate change, I don't have any more bandwidth, come back in 10 years. So, and now people are saying, okay, we've got to do it. Now, can you help us point to something that'll allow us to do it? And I think what I hope I've showed is that there are many, many things you can point to, many good experiences, and if we put them together cleverly, I think we can turn the train around. With that, I thank you for your attention. If you have comments or questions, I'm in your hands, of course, but... Sir.
The UK is implementing the biodiversity net gain coming winter. Can you tell us what's the scenario outside of the UK?
Well, the scenario in the UK is that they're headed for elections, so anything could happen there. I wouldn't count on the current government taking it very far. If there is a change of government, then of course things open up, other things close down. But I think that there is a sense in the UK that having left the European Union, they have to show that there are benefits from it, and that they can do things that the lethargic processes of the EU render difficult. And so there's a thirst for innovation in the UK that I think is a positive thing. I think every country is experimenting. Every country is trying to figure out what they can do, how they can get a comparative advantage, either a first mover advantage or a special advantage. Last week I was in London. They held a meeting in which the question was, how can we make London the global capital of nature finance? Well, I was at one in Geneva in October last year, which asked the question, how can we make Geneva the capital of finance? And the interesting thing is that there is no capital today of nature finance. Where would you go if you want to look? I mean, I can point you to the Rabobank in the Netherlands, which has done some amazing innovations. I can point you to a company called Nature Alpha in the UK, which is organizing nature-related data. I can point to all sorts of really interesting things. There's new forms of corporate existence that are recognized by the New York Stock Exchange, nature-based companies, and there's a huge amount of innovation going on. What I think is that all of this is up for grabs. That any clever entrepreneur would look at this landscape and say, "My God, there are just unbelievable opportunities here." And it isn't a question of going to the board of Credit Suisse or UBS and saying, "Guys, you should take this stuff seriously." They know that. They know that. They're just trying to deal with that balancing act of pension funds that want a certain earning per year, of a legal system that discourages innovation, of a very low risk appetite on the part of investors. You talk to most investors, they say, "We're looking for green projects. Give us green projects. We got tons of capital." You give them lots of green projects, and they say, "Yeah, but the risk return. I need a 12% return in 2 quarters. Please, let's get serious about this thing." It's not to say that there aren't nature projects that give a reasonable return, but if you look at sustainable finance, sustainable investment, responsible investment, impact investment, 90% of it is solar panels in Spain or Cyprus. The risk is zero. The technology is well known, and so when it comes to nature, perceived risk is higher. Doesn't mean that the risk is higher. Perceived risk is higher, and the rate of return is over a longer period of time. It's probably also lower, but it's over a longer period of time. So we need a different form of investment, what they call in the US deep impact investment, where the purpose of the investment is the sustainable outcome. If you can make money on it as well, fantastic, but that's not the purpose. And so they've reversed, if you like, the burden of proof. And the burden of proof that you're expected to give is around the sustainability impact of the project. And more philanthropies are doing that. More and more family offices are doing that. So I think we're still stuck in a traditional way of thinking about how financial operations work, and not enough thinking about, well, if that doesn't work, design something else that does. Move it one step out of the system, experiment with it. All this stuff I showed you about alt protein and vertical farming, it's just taking off. It's there. The risk is there. The investment capital is there. People are willing to take risks about it. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. When you spoke about the nature markets, you said that the nature was going to be valued and traded. More or less, what do you mean by that? You track every single tree or something?
No. I hope that's not the net result of the development of nature markets. No. So I describe nature markets as markets in goods and services that have nature positive outcomes. So the nature positive outcome is non-negotiable. If it's a nature market, it is that there are nature positive outcomes that, if properly valued and properly priced, will find a market. There are financial instruments that allow that kind of trading to take place. And what I think is the challenge is not so much imagining products or services that can make up a nature market, but looking at the transition. Now, I remember when I was a child in the UK, they had these sort of, Margaret Thatcher wanted to close down uneconomic coal mines, which, clearly was economically the right decision. The problem was not so much closing down the unprofitable coal mine, it was, what do you do with the people that work there? And so Margaret Thatcher said, we're spending a £1 million a day subsidizing uneconomic coal production, right? £1 million a day then is probably 10 million today, right? The answer was not, and therefore we closed down the mine. The answer was, let's take that 10 million and invest it in job retraining, invest it in small and medium-sized enterprise in the coal mining areas, invested in the transition. And so what we're looking for is the identification of new nature markets, but also then a transition plan that ensures that they replace traditional markets in a way that benefits the people and the communities around there. We're doing something on gold in the Amazon, which is very interesting in this respect, because the local communities and indigenous peoples tend not to benefit from it because the activity is illegal. And so if you can make it legal and invest in making it responsible, you can give the benefits to the local communities and the indigenous peoples there while respecting their decision-making power over their own land. So the challenge, I think, lies in the transition, not simply in identifying the opportunity. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to reappear up here with the first panel. So what we want to do with these roundtables is two things. One, I guess I painted a general picture of what I think is happening around the world, some of the more interesting developments. But in these two roundtables, we want to bring it back down to the reality of financial and economic actors, and in particular, to try and understand better the experience of Spain, Spanish institutions, and actors in addressing these questions. I think the interest that you have is not so much what's happening in Japan or what's happening in Argentina as what's happening in Spain. How you're making progress, you're able to overcome this, and do you actually have innovations that you would like to talk about, things that you're doing, things that you're trying? And I know that all of you have a great deal of experience, not only in Spain but internationally, so that we can reflect that. I know that Tony Balariga, for example, was the vice chair of the UNEP Finance Initiative, which is probably one of the most exciting places where sustainable finance is being discussed and where experimentation is taking place. And all of you, I think, in your own experiences, have a great deal of international experience that you are all, I think, trying to bring back to Spain. So I would like to introduce the panel here. I mentioned Tony Malabriga, who's the head of responsible business at BBVA, and of course has an international finance career as well. Marga Rocio is a sustainable and climate change partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers here in Spain, and of course the whole of the consulting industry is not indifferent to what's happening out there on sustainable finance. Joan Cabezas, CEO of Nactiva and Director of Natural Capital Business at the Palladium Group, which is active in, I think, over 100 countries around the world. In fact, Joan's experience includes a great deal of time abroad. So I think relating what we see at the international level to the reality in Spain, looking at some of the more experimental things that are happening in Spain, and then perhaps discussing. And finally, of course, Pedro Ruiz, a sustainability specialist with Nestlé in Spain. As a Swiss citizen, I salute you, and I'm glad you're representing our leading industry so well. I will ask each of the panelists to make a very brief introduction, and then I hope that I can address some questions to you, and perhaps even get a discussion going among the panelists. If there is time in each case, I will revert to the audience as well. But Tony, perhaps you can start by telling us your experience.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Great to be here, and great to see an additional activity at the center. So fantastic, and focus on this key topic, as you said, Mark, is gaining momentum, no? Among the regulators community, investors, banks, financial institutions, and companies as a whole. No? So I think it's relevant. Well, let's share the journey that we are having on the approach of as BBVA that we have to nature and nature capital, no? Because it's true that, as you said, it's something that it creates more complexity how a bank, in this case, can manage its impacts and risk and dependencies and opportunities. No, we see three mega trends in the world. Obviously, challenges: climate change, inequality, and obviously natural capital. No, and the three ones are completely interdependent. And we have placed sustainability at the core of our business strategy, and we have included in our policy these three dimensions of the challenges that we have. So not only biodiversity, but the natural capital as a whole. So one of our goals of our strategy is to preserve and to promote the regeneration of the natural capital. So that's already guiding our activity. No? But this is a learning process. And we see this also as a business opportunity. Obviously, we have risk and dependencies. But if you want to change the world, that's what we want to do. It has to have economic sense. We need the support from regulators, from companies, from the society as a whole, and obviously from the financial sector. And it will happen if it has economic sense. And so we see a big business opportunity. You raised this figure of Paulson Institute, about around $700-800 billion as the financing gap that needs to be covered. So as a bank, obviously, we understand that is a business opportunity for us to finance this transformation. So let me share what we have done in this journey, because we start, let's say, having a not so holistic approach, but it's quite normal in banks. So we have some norms and policies in place to mitigate our impacts and risk on natural capital. We have sector policies on key sectors like agribusiness, mining, energy, infrastructure, that we have some red lines that we want to maintain. No? Also, we have Equator principles. It's a framework to ensure that we have social but environmental issues also into our due diligence process in project finance. But this is not enough. No? And what we decided 1 year ago is that we have to have a more holistic approach to nature. So we decided to endorse the TNFD. We are members of the TNFD forum, and try to apply on a pilot base the LEAP approach to assess our impacts, risk, dependencies, and obviously business opportunities. And also, we decided to use the tools and methodologies that are promoted in this case by UNEP-FI, which is the core tool that you have mentioned. And we decided to work with this framework and these methodologies and tools in order to make an additional step. And let's focusing on risk and on opportunities. Let's share a couple of examples. No? On risk, what we have done is starting to have a heat map of our risk and impacts and dependencies, nature-related. No? So we have used Anchor tool to identify our dependency and our impacts on nature, and we have realized that practically 45% of our exposure are nature dependent. So 45%. So half of the GDP or half of our. So it's quite related to the. Well, you said 100%, but then the WEF says 50%, but you say 100%. But anyway, that's what we have. So we have identified that agribusiness, power, oil and gas, these type of activities are highly dependent on biodiversity and natural capital. So the first, we have made this map. Second, on risk area, what we have done is a water stress in a sector. We have to pilot. It's very difficult to start with everything. So we decided to pilot water stress in power generation. We realized that matching 7,000 plants with the aqueduct database from the World Resources Institute, we realized that practically 23% of exposure has high risk or very high risk of water stress. So another interesting insight that we get. So that's what we are doing. We are starting to implement, piloting some tools and data in order to step by step embedding this into all the different tools that we have in our risk management. We plan to include this in our sectoral plans. We plan to include this in our ESG client onboarding questionnaire. So we are embedding this in let's say, you said you don't like business as usual, but try to embed this as a part of our how we do business, okay? And then in terms of opportunities, maybe later we have more time, but the idea is that we see it as a huge business opportunity. We have first include nature into our sustainable finance standard. So now we are translating the new delegated acts in Europe related to biodiversity and so on, but we have started this even before. So we have already some standards internally that we can clarify when we can consider sustainable finance or not. And this help us to define and how we mobilize our target of 300 billion euros on sustainable finance, including also nature. So in terms of reforestation, in terms of water infrastructure, in terms of water efficiency and so on, that's one piece. And the second piece I would like to highlight, I conclude with that, is there is a big room to embed this nature-related data, KPIs, into more sophisticated mechanism, not use of proceeds, but in those financing KPI link that you have mentioned, like for instance this sovereign debt. So what we are doing already, we have already done is, for instance, a water footprint loan with Iberdrola, 2.5 billion euros, together with 20 banks. They have set a target in terms of reducing 50% of water, improving CDP water score by 2025, 2030. And we have linked that financing, providing better price if they achieve those targets. So that's a good example how we can mobilize as banks, let's say a more transformative process, beyond the use of proceeds with a direct financing. I think that's the way we can mobilize. It's only a few examples. And we are now focusing on water. We can comment a little bit more later.
Thanks, Tony. So it sounds like you're quite advanced in introducing...
Learning. We are learning, step by step.
Capital into your financial models.
Yeah.
So it's not something on the outside that you look at after you've made all your analysis, but it's very much part of the way your models work. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, what we have learned is that we have created fantastic avenues with the climate experience in order to embed climate in all of what we do in terms of business development, solutions, and also risk management. Now what we are doing is try to use those avenues to work together, climate and nature, because it's the only way to make this at a scale required. So we see really that this is a huge opportunity. It has specific challenges that we can comment later, but that's the only way.
The way to do this is to regard nature and climate as opportunities for the bank and figure out how those opportunities can best be deployed.
That changed the game. I mean, I remember having been working for sustainability close to 20 years, having worked in BBA for 16 years. There is a moment where an institution, a financial institution in this case, realized that this massive disruption that we are going to have it requires this huge amount of investment, and it requires a massive asset reallocation, and it requires a role for the bank to capture a disproportionate market share of this growth that is going to happen. So it's make economic sense to make and that's the way we think that despite we have to manage risks, dependencies, and we have to obviously report and everything, this is the way to transform the business as usual and to embed this into our daily activity.
Thank you. Marga, you from the service industry, right? Consulting services industry. Everybody turns to you to figure out how to do this. Maybe just introductory remarks and a couple of questions for you. How it's working in Spain?
Yeah, sure. I have to say, first of all, that BBVA probably is in Spain, considering the context that we see in Spain, is a front runner, even what Tony has just said. But what we see in the market in Spain, even the listed companies, but especially also SMEs or bigger companies or family companies, biodiversity in that sense or natural capital they are far away yet from that. I would say they have just realized climate change, and they have already assumed targets in terms of net zero targets or calculating the whole carbon footprint in that sense. So they are realizing that the next frontier is going to be biodiversity. in that sense. But from our view, one thing that is going to change also this perception from the companies is going to be regulation. You have already mentioned in your presentation. We see, for example, that all the sustainability reporting regulation that is coming from the European Union, the CSRD directive in that sense, is going to force companies, even in Spain, and in the case of Spain and in whole Europe, is going to force companies with more than 250 employees, which is pretty small enterprises already. It has estimated that more than 50,000 companies in Europe has to report with these standards. The standards already foreseen and have very clear setting the scene and the map for the companies to report on, seeing and recognizing the nexus and the linkages between all the environmental vectors that we have: water, climate, energy, biodiversity, circular economy, and so on. And they are going to force companies to make these assessments that BBA has already begun to do with the tools that we have, Encore, Aqueduct, and so on. But they are going to be forced to begin to see with their eyes which is the risk, which are the biodiversity dependencies that they have, quantifying it, not only the climate, but also the biodiversity, water, circular economy. So they are going to begin to see which is the value that you mentioned. I think this is significant that we are sitting here in the Barcelona Stock Exchange market house, because we recognize the power of the markets, and we recognize, and as PwC Network, we recognize that this natural capital, and I stress the why we call it natural capital and not mention biodiversity, which is a capital that we have and we need to maintain. It's a capital is a financial word. I think this is important also to stress that. So we recognize that you need to value that capital, and then market that capital, obviously with the constraints that you have already mentioned, Mark, in your speech. But for doing that, from PwC, we also see the data point, because we have talked with lots of companies and with investors, and we see two things in terms of data. The lack of data that TNFD is going to tackle, and all the tools that we have already developed within Core to be able to do this risk analysis, scenario analysis, and so on. But we do have yet some gap in terms of data, availability of data, shortcomings on data quality, in terms of biodiversity. We are a consultant firm, but also we are an audit firm, so we have to provide reliability and give confidence to the market and the companies on the data. So this work is also, we as PwC as a firm, the reliability and quality of the data. But also, once we have the data in terms of biodiversity, we know, because companies told us or investors told us, they don't know, they lack the knowledge to use this data to make decisions, business decisions. So the translation of this data is also needed. So both things in terms of data quality, availability, and so on, but also translation for a useful in terms of business.
Interesting what you said about regulation. Do you get the sense that companies are looking for regulation?
No,
they're looking.
They don't look. They don't want the regulation, but yeah.
But it's coming anyway.
Yeah. But once the regulation is coming, they are asking. Companies are asking, and we are asking to European Union for the European standards reporting. We ask for clear methodologies. We have the LEAP methodology, TNFD, but we are not still yet at that point that everything is clear, everything is going to be homogenized. So we have to work a little bit on that yet.
In France, I get the impression that companies and financial actors are actually asking for regulation because the uncertainty in the market.
Yeah, the financial entities.
Very different.
Yeah.
Difficult. So that perhaps there is a tolerance for new regulation needed that would actually organize the markets in a slightly better way.
Yeah. And in terms of financial undertakings, they need the information for the non-financial undertakings. So they need that this information are going to feed their assessments.
Interest in the development of biodiversity credit markets, new financial mechanisms to address natural capital?
Yeah, definitely we see in terms of sustainable finance, we see, because also we work with private equity houses and investors and banks and financial entities, we see also this thirst for impact investment, as you say, and biodiversity is one part of the pie in terms of impact, because we have seen, you have mentioned everything focused on climate, renewable energy, solar panels, but we need also investment in biodiversity in terms of blue economy. For example, we have seen some blue bonds or green bonds. So we are seeing that the whole financial markets and investors and financial world is turning into that and asking for also for help, and we are going to discuss it later, which type of instruments do we have to develop on that.
So let me jump to Pedro and then finish with Joan. Pedro, you represent a very large multinational company but are operational here in Spain. It could be argued that Nestlé is a nature company. Its fundamental business is in resources that derive from nature. Are you seeing within your own company great pressure to integrate natural capital with your financial models and your investment models?
Yeah, thank you. Biodiversity have to be one of our priorities in our strategic master plan, definitely. And because it's embedded in the frame of the purpose of the company. The purpose of Nestlé is to unlock the power of food, to improve quality of life, and now for the generations to come. So we think about the future, and we work in the respect for the people, respect for the communities, and respect for the planet. And in this respect for the planet, we have developed our strategic master plan in 5 priorities. It's climate change, it's circular economy, it's water stewardship and biodiversity, it's communication, it's positive on our commitment, and training and awareness. So if we talk about biodiversity and water stewardship, I think it's the time to share some practical projects we have developed at local level. Because we have some worldwide projects in cocoa or coffee, but it's not so near as here, no, in Spain. But we have some very nice projects in biodiversity, for example, linked to the value chain in the local products. For example, we have one factory very near here in the Montseny Park Natural Park. The relationship between the factory and the natural park is very, very, very close. And we had made a project to recuperate a kind of amphibious is in risk of extinction. And the KPI is the numbers of red frog in this amphibious, in this park. So we have to recuperate and regenerate some rafts, how we manage the water in the park, and all this. And we following these KPIs. We have this project for the next 3 years to follow this community of amphibians in the park. Another second project is in Herrera del Duque, is in Extremadura. There's also around a factory, a water bottle factory, also in a area as a reserve of the biosphere, and is a fish called jarabugo in the river, a river fish, who also is in terms of in danger of extinction. It's a fish who needs to not have to be trees around the river. So we have financed also a project to plant more than 2,000 trees along the river to protect this fish. It's called jarabugo. If you look, Google that, jarabugo is the name of the fish, and we also have this practical project. A third project is in the milk district. when we receive the milk for more than 200 farmers in the north of Spain, we have detected that there's an important biodiversity around the farms, especially focused on birds. And with NGO, it's not Nestle who say we are good in that or we are doing that. It's an NGO, it's called Sea Over Life, who is working with us in the cartography of these 200 farms about to protect the birds and the biodiversity around the farm. And the fourth project is in cereals in Castilla y León. In cereals we use for our baby food. We are practicing with 7 farmers, about 1,000 hectares and about 5,000 tons of cereals. A pilot project with regenerative agriculture, using the best practices in that for one hand to capture carbon in the earth, and for other hand to improve biodiversity in the area. So I think this is some practical examples how we are integrating biodiversity in the business, and in some projects then our business can communicate, can put in value, and can share with consumers and clients, because consumers each time are more worried about from where come the products and what is the environmental impact. So these kind of projects could be an answer of that.
So are you seeing in general among your clients a greater pressure for Nestle to prove that it is acting in a responsible way from nature, or is it just that you are experimenting with ways of including nature in some of the projects that you're doing?
We have distinguished consumers and clients. Consumers are more worried about that. Yeah. Clients are more worried about price. So, but the consumer at the end is the focus of our product. And if you ask them how is they can choose a product or another in the shelves, it's important to have this type of projects.
And you're seeing a growth in the concern of consumers for the biodiversity footprint of your activity?
We have a nice example about the tomato sauce. Solis is a local brand of tomato sauce. It's not very high add value, a tomato sauce. And the market share was decreasing in some years, was decreasing because the white label is cheaper and the consumers don't. And we start a project with the Junta de Extremadura, with the producción integrada de tomate, with the best practices in optimize the use of water, minimize the use of fertilizants, and natural control of plagues in the tomato lands in Extremadura, in Vegas del Guadiana. And then with this certification, we launched an initiative, it's called Solis Responsable, with this project based on the producción integrada de tomate. And then the sales of this brand increased and the market share was recuperated. So it's an example that you can, from a marketing point of view, you can use these practices to relaunch a brand. Yeah. But the important thing is to make before you you talk about that.
Do it first.
Because sometimes the risk of greenwashing and all these things. So we make the project from 2014 to 2018, and in 2018 we relaunch the brand with all these good practices we have made before.
So, Joan, your company and your group are based on impact. So it's not a question of how you integrate the impact into your operations. You are about that. And so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what changes you're seeing and what opportunities you see.
Sure. Well, here first I'm learning a lot from all of you, and I have to thank you for inviting me to be in this panel. I have a dual hat in this presentation. One is the company that I have been working for the last 20 years, This is a positive impact company. We identify, design, fund, and implement positive impact programs in more than 100 countries, and trying to address challenges in education, in healthcare, in natural capital, in governance, in economic growth, agriculture. Its name is the Palladium Group, and yes, well, that's the company that I have been working for long. And one of the things that we have realized is that now that the world, as you said, as you rightly presented, or part of the world probably, have reached the awareness stage about the problems and the challenges that we have, maybe our responsibility is to find innovative solutions that are up to the challenge, right? So if we try, our vision is that if we try to solve different problems and bigger problems faster with the same institutions and the same rules and regulations and even investment rules, probably it will not be possible. And if it's possible, it will be very, very long, right? It will take very long. So our modest innovation is to set up collective platforms or spaces where different companies, investors, public sector, civil society, NGOs, etc., agree to work on developing and restoring and protecting natural capital. That's an innovation, and we call it collective platforms. And why are we doing this? Because I think most of the companies now, especially the market leaders, the global leaders, are doing great things, trying to integrate and embed into their value chains the transformation, the biodiversity objectives, etc. But when you look at the landscape and the natural capital, maybe we need to use this effort and align this effort in the same valley with some other companies that are interested in the forest restoration, and some other companies that are interested in, the water quality, right, etc. So that's the kind of thing that we try to do, and that's why we created recently a platform here based in Barcelona called Nactiva. That it's a platform, a collective platform that has the objective to protect and regenerate the natural capital in the Mediterranean. So we believe that the Mediterranean ecology is quite similar. If you go from the western side to the eastern side, north and south, we share the same challenges, and especially our natural capital is very important for our economies, for our life, for our way of life, for the way we eat, for the way we enjoy the open air, for our climate, for attracting people to live here and to visit us. So what we realize is that maybe here it's a right place to set up another platform with the base in Barcelona. We convince some big organizations and mid-sized organizations. We like this mix at the very beginning. We have with us CaixaBank and Naturgy and Akbar and Molins and Celsa and Occidente and also some other companies that are more new, maybe that grew from with a sustainability mindset from the very beginning, like Ametller Origin, like Flax and Kale, some professional services like Grant Thornton, some investment management companies like GIA. So all these companies, we are together under this platform, right? And what they do is they pay and they invest in a group of people that it's not us, it's not a group of people per se, because we work with a lot of technical companies, we work a lot of technological centers and universities, etc., to align what the companies want with what the natural capital needs and what the technological companies and technical partners can develop, right? So what we do is this, and we are starting with projects in forests, we are starting with projects in water, in what we call Nactiva Land, which is the food production in our territories, and lastly, but importantly, the coastal areas. So that's what we do, and we believe that once we have these platforms, I think some of the challenges that you mentioned to accelerate the pace of the implementation of this can be mitigated. We still need to see this, but for example, access to finance. If we have all these collective groups of companies committing to the offtake of certain services, right? It's easier to find an investor or a debt service, right, to fund an initiative that can grow at scale. Or even the efficiency in identifying those projects and make these projects feasible, right? Measuring the impact of those projects. Why all the companies, they need to measure the impact by themselves. So generating efficiencies so that we can attract and pool more resources and generate a greater impact. Another important thing is that we believe that we need to look at projects and interventions that can be replicable and scalable. I think this is something that for the investment community, they love. We need to learn some things from the digital world, from other spaces, and replicability and scalability is important. So if we find solutions for rivers that are crossing cities or smaller villages in the Mediterranean, in Catalonia, El Llobregat, the Ter, and many others, and we find some solutions that increase biodiversity and increase the quality of the water, and etc., and the quality of life of the citizens, then we can export this to Italy. We can replicate this endless times, right? Or sometimes if we start to manage properly 1,000 hectares, then we can convince all the other landowners, right, to manage 10,000 hectares, right? And then we gain scale just by replicating the same methodology. So we are trying to innovate and offer this type of innovation to be recipient of investments and also generating efficiencies to this fragmented world.
So in the business world, you might call this building cooperation in the pre-competitive space.
Yeah.
So that you are doing all of the work needed to prepare for when things become proprietorial and when individual actors want to compete, and making it possible for them to have more impact as they do so.
I am very often asked this question, and I normally answer, I understand the question, but I think we need to change the categories that we use to analyze this type of things. Because nature is a different, nature investments, I believe, that the challenge we have is that we need to define it as a new asset class. And as a new asset class that has different components, maybe we have to guarantee the capital for the people who is investing, right? And find mechanisms via blended instruments to guarantee the capital with low interest rate. Okay, but then maybe we will attract a lot of these pension funds and patient investors from the Middle East and some other places, right? I say the Middle East because I've been living there for some time and I know what they're expecting, right? Yeah, but this is, I think, this collaboration and cooperation related to nature and biodiversity and climate can continue. I mean, can be the form. We don't need to solve this as a company only. Of course, everybody needs to do their job. But as a platform, is maybe the vehicle to do this forever, right? So that's our hypothesis. We're testing it. We have other coalitions working and actively working. Of course, in the UK, because they are very curious and advanced, and they want to, but it's growing very fast. And I don't see any of the companies trying to say, no, now I take it only for me. They get all the honors and all the awards of investing in something, but they are doing this collectively with others, and they share the outcomes, right? I don't know, maybe our humble, maybe not from the technical aspect of investment, but as an innovation, as entrepreneurial innovation that can also be replicated. Maybe this is our
all of you have a comment?
No, I mean, I totally agree with Juan's point. I mean, we need collaborative efforts. We need a systemic change. So this type of platforms or collaborative initiatives is not exactly to create the preconditions to compete. It's a new way to collaborate and to create what the world needs, no? And I have seen a lot of complexity within the financial sector, no? UNEP is a good example. We are there 600 financial institutions, no? All together. Why? Well, because we see this huge challenge in front of us. We understand that we need a common framework, a common toolkit, some guidelines to understand how we can manage this as a systemic. and it's not question only who is going to arrive first on the finish line. The race will be won when the last one will cross the finish line as well. So we need to create this movement, and platforms like this, I think it's a good, no, in our case, we try to be everywhere to understand how we can partner. Obviously you have to compete, but you have to see where you can work together.
So I have to wrap up this session, but let me just say, perhaps offer this as a conclusion, that as we face this common challenge that we all see out there, we all understand its importance, we all know that the way in which we do business will have to change. We are looking not simply at technological innovation or at financial instrument innovation or at risk management innovation, but we're actually looking at process innovation and institutional innovation as well.
Yeah.
So that collaborative platforms are not necessarily an alternative to competition, but they can be a complement to competition. Joan?
And I think it's important that we show leadership with that, right? We need more entrepreneurs and more leaders up to this challenge, right? And regionally and micro and macro, but setting up these collective platforms everywhere is, I think, what can make the difference, right? These leaders and action-oriented, not just for awareness or for fighting or for you're guilty of this or you're guilty of that. No, let's organize a project, let's create something, let's build something. So I think it's positive leadership. Also, these platforms offer a possibility to establish a positive dialogue with the public sector, right? Yeah. And aligning strategies, aligning the regulation. So
let me just venture something for Luis and Angel and the others from the Financial Center. This is in a way a perfect role for a financial center organization, because it does bring together the different players, and it is part of an international network, so it can draw from experience from what was tried in London, what was tried in Luxembourg, what was tried in Kigali, and see whether that can be brought to Barcelona, implemented here, adapted here, and likewise what you're experimenting with going there. So we talked today about the idea of the Financial Centers Network putting out best practice guidelines. How do you put in place a green bond framework? Policy, regulatory, how do you do it? And what can you learn from the many, many different financial centers that have introduced green bonds on what they did right and what they did wrong, what they would do if they had to do it again, and so on, and share that information just like you're doing on the platform. So if we can end with that message to the Financial Center, then I count on you as members of the Financial Center to make sure that they offer you that service. So thank you very much. Hello, Giovanni, can you hear us and see us?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't see much, but I know where you are.
You know where we are, and we can hear you well and see you. So I hope that will be
excellent,
sufficient for you. We're waiting for the other members of the panel to come forward and occupy their seats. Giovanni, we just had a first panel where we looked at the challenge of building biodiversity and natural capital into financial operations in a way that leads to nature positive results. And the first panel looked at some very practical examples of innovations, how you address the data challenges, how you address the different standards, some of the experimentation that's taking place in Barcelona or more broadly in Spain around some of these issues. And what we want to do now with this second panel is to look at the sort of policy, political, legal developments around nature finance. And you are team leader Green Finance for the European Commission's DG Environment, I believe.
I will try to share my screen, so I hope it will be easier to follow. I know that some of you may be already familiar with the topic I want to discuss, so I hope it will not be a repetition, but I hope to give you some some update on the latest developments here in Brussels, so at least this can be interesting for everybody. Let me just try again, and we see if it works. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
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 Okay. Anyway, the topic I want to discuss is the EU taxonomy and the do not significant harm principle in particular. So just a quick introduction on this. The EU taxonomy is part of the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. The EU Sustainable Finance Framework is a broad initiative of the Commission which aims to mobilize all sources of finance to reach the goals of the European Green Deal. So today I will focus on the EU taxonomy, but I want to mention other two main pillars of this strategy. The first one is on disclosure. It was mentioned in the previous panel. So there are comprehensive regimes in the EU which applies to both financial institutions and non-financial undertakings to disclose and provide investors all the information they need to make investment decisions towards sustainable finance goals. And the other pillars is the tools. The Commission is developing a broad set of tools which will allow companies and market participants to have the means and the instruments to already see which are the available financial instruments that they can use to go and invest directly into sustainable finance instruments. I will focus today on the EU taxonomy. The EU taxonomy was the regulation, which is the overarching, let's say, piece of legislation, was adopted in 2020, and it's under continued development. We update it via delegated acts, and I will elaborate more on that. This slide is a bit bent, but it's trying to capture what is the EU taxonomy in one page. So the EU taxonomy is a classification system. So it's basically a list of economic activities. And for these economic activities, they are scientific-based criteria, so technical screening criteria, which allows to understand if such activity is substantially contributing or not to one of the environmental objectives. So concretely, to be into the EU taxonomy, so to be aligned with EU taxonomy, there are three conditions that has to be met at the same time. The first one is to substantially contribute to one environmental objective, but at the same time, do not significantly harm any of the other objectives. This is a very key point, and I will elaborate on this. The third condition is regarding some minimum safeguards on social and human rights safeguards. Exactly. The fact that the activity has to substantially contribute to one environmental objective seems a natural choice. What is very relevant in this case is the do not significant harm part. So it means that it is not sufficient that an activity is doing some, let's say, good. It's not harming the environment, and it's actually proposing a greener solution. But at the same time, it has not to impact all the others. So when talking about the environmental objectives, we refer to 6 objectives. We broadly divide them in 2 groups. The first group is composed by the 2 climate objectives, so the climate change mitigation and the climate change adaptation objective. And then there are 4 other objectives, which are the transition to a circular economy, the pollution prevention and control objective, the sustainable use of water and marine resources, and which is the topic also of this conference today, the protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystem. So, as some of you may be more familiar with the taxonomy, two delegated acts, so the implementing rules of EU taxonomy for the climate objectives have already been adopted. They are up and running, and they are called the Climate DA and the Complementary Climate DA. They contain a list of activities covering these objectives, and they are already available. The Climate DA is already applicable to market players, and the Complementary DA will be applicable next year. What is the main update I want to share with you is that on the other 4 environmental objectives, the Commission has been working together with the Platform of Sustainable Finance to prepare an upcoming environmental delegated act. And this is expected to come into force this year. So just to give you a bit of a time frame, there is a required 6 months scrutiny period for the co-legislators to adopt this delegated act. So the Commission is expected to publish it very soon. If you do the reverse calculation, you may understand that it's coming in the next few weeks. So in the Environmental Delegated Act, there will be, as I was mentioning, a list of activities, economic activities, and for these economic activities, there will be technical screening criteria to set the activity level, making a substantial contribution to the environmental objective. But also there will be the do not significant harm criteria, not affecting any of them. Focusing on the do not significant harm principle for the biodiversity, these are the principle which applies to all activities, no matter which environmental objective they want to make a substantial contribution. They still have to be do not harm the biodiversity objective. And in particular, in this case, not to harm the biodiversity objective. The activity has to be, so here it's in the reverse side, so it's considered to be harmful if it's detrimental to the good condition and resilience of the ecosystems, or if it's detrimental to the conservation status of habitats and species. So, at the risk of simplifying a bit, it means that no matter which economic activities who substantially contribute to any environmental objective still have to comply with these requirements for the do not significant harm on biodiversity. I will now make just 2 examples to show a bit more concretely how it looks like. The disclaimer is that this is the text which went into public consultation last month. So this is not the final text, so it's just for your reference to show how it looks like. So this is an example of an activity substantially contributing to the biodiversity objective. The activity is conservation, including restoration of habitats, ecosystem, and species. And you can see on the right side how the technical screening criteria look like. So there are some general conditions and some more specific conditions which address the, let's say, who, how, and what the players have to do to be considered as substantially contributing to this environmental objective. In parallel, I can show an example of the do not significant harm for biodiversity. So I picked up, again, this is with the disclaimer that this is not a final text, but it's just what went into public consultation last month. So this is an activity which is construction of new buildings. which set the criteria for substantial contribution to circular economy. So when the activity meets those criteria, still has to meet the do not significant harm criteria, which in this case, for new construction, it means that the new construction has not to be built on arable land, on greenfield land, and on land matching the definition of forest, as in the national law. I hope this was not too quick, but I'm happy to elaborate on any point where you want to have a bit more background. Thank you.
What he's done is to set a very good framework for our discussions, because this second part, the second roundtable, is designed not so much to look at the innovations and processes, but at the broader policy framework that's being put in place. And for a country like Spain, for a region like Catalonia, the key reference is, of course, the European Union and the frameworks that it puts in place and the obligations that it requires of business and financial actors. So bearing in mind the publication of the EU's Sustainable Finance Framework, of the taxonomies that are related to it, and more specifically the recent editions of biodiversity-related taxonomy, I'll turn now to Marc Vilaur, General Directorate of Environmental Policies and Natural Environment of the Government of Catalonia. So your responsibility is to take those things and to ensure that they're properly implemented here, but I think probably also to feed back to Brussels the experiences you had, what worked, what didn't work, what worked smoothly, what adaptations might make it better. So the first question to you, after you've made your short presentation, will be how useful and practical and implementable is the material that you're receiving from it. But please tell us a little bit about what you're doing first.
Thank you very much, Mark. I will also thank very much Barcelona Centre Financer Europeu for inviting the government and also Borsa de Barcelona. First, I have to confess, Mark, that when I read the first time the planetary boundaries article in Nature or Science, I didn't remember now in which was the scientific article, but I started to be a preacher on this theory, and I never imagined that I would be here in the Borsa de Barcelona talking about that, but even I wouldn't less imagine that somebody would talk about that before me. And that was you. So you are the demonstration that, the consideration that we can be together in this situation, in this crisis, because we are in a global crisis. It's not only a climate crisis or a biodiversity crisis. It's a global crisis, global environmental crisis that we have to face together. And I can say just that we need to collaborate, the whole of the actors of the society, in order to make this shift, this change, this drastic change that some of you have explained before. But as government, what we have done and what we want to do. First of all, we have to understand that Catalonia is a little country, but which has most of the biodiversity that we can find in the European Union. Well, at 20%, but for 32,000 square kilometers is quite a lot. And we are facing a bit the same crisis as the other parts of Europe are facing. We are losing about 25% of our biodiversity, more than 50% in fresh waters and wetlands, 34% in farmland, and also 10% in our forests, even if we are one of the countries that are increasing more their surface in forests. So we are losing biodiversity everywhere. And we also know that we don't know all the biodiversity we have or we lose, as most of the countries. Because if we compare it to climate change, that is not a simple problem, but is quite easy to identify. We cannot just establish a monocriterial path in order to understand what's happening and how we can solve it. We have to reduce the temperature or not increase more than 2 degrees the temperature, and we have to reduce our emissions of CO2. Biodiversity is much more complex, and we need to face it from a complex perspective. We, as government, started with 4 levers in order to face this problem. The first is knowledge. And we built the Observatory of Biodiversity and Natural Heritage on July 2022, with the aim to share all the information about biodiversity from not only the government, but also the research centers, and also all those people who work in citizen science, etc. So the first step was to find a place where all information about biodiversity can be shared, can be transformed, and can be adapted for policymakers. This is our first lever in order to find solution to this biodiversity crisis, this environmental and global crisis. The second lever we are working on now is the Nature Agency of Catalonia. To face this situation, we are not facing a normal situation that can be managed in a normal way. We need faster, easier, and more efficient ways to manage the relation between human species and other species. So we are creating the Agency of Nature of Catalonia with the aim to be more efficient, with the aim to work with all the vectors of the economy, with all the sectors, the political, sectorial policies, in order to incorporate the vector biodiversity on it. And in order to understand that biodiversity is not only in a natural park, but biodiversity is on every step and every square meter of this country. And we have to manage it in a holistic way. The third lever we are facing, we are starting to work, is the Natural Heritage and Biodiversity Strategy. In fact, it has been approved in 2018. We've ended the first period, and we are starting to create the second period of this strategy. The strategy is a strategy in order to achieve the neutral or the zero reduction of biodiversity in 2030, as the European plans say, and as we have compromise of government. This strategy has the aim also to implement different action lines, 85, to work in all the strategic and all the sectorial policies. The fourth lever is the money. We need funds for nature. And because we created a very innovative law, the climate change law, we are able to say now that more than 80, well, at the end, 80 millions from this tax goes to nature conservation, and 80 millions from this tax goes to climate change prevention and reduction. Nowadays, we have more than 150 million euros that are entirely going to face this problem from now to this problem ends, and we don't have to put a tax to pollutant machinery, vehicles, or industries like tourism in this case. Nowadays, we're facing also the need to go over our initial strategies because Kunming-Montreal has compromised to go further in this fight, in this real challenge that we have. We need to change the direction of our subsidies. We need to change drastically our policy, but we cannot do it alone. We need all of you, private sector, also citizenship, in order to help this change to be real, because it cannot be done with only a few political decisions. This cannot be only the responsibility of the politicians. So I ask you, please help us, and let's work together. We will have, you will have us all the times you need for everything you need. But please, let's work together in order to find a solution to the big problem, the big challenge we have as society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. And that was a very moving appeal to work across institutional lines and mobilize to meet the challenges that we're facing. One quick question to you based on what Giovanni was saying. Are you satisfied that do no harm is a sufficient standard? Or do you think we should go further, given that we've done so much damage already? Do we not need to set a standard that requires financial activity to lead to restoration, not simply no further deterioration?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to understand that these standards we have to follow have to be adaptive. So the standard that works today maybe is not working at all tomorrow. Because we are understanding better nature, and maybe we understand that some of the postulates we put are not working anymore. So I think European Union is giving us a nice way to go, no? And we need to follow it. Yeah. And we need to understand better what's happening, and then maybe we can help European Union to work together to find a most effective way in order to face this challenge that, in difference with others, maybe we don't have a clear horizon to reflect.
Well, thanks. It's encouraging to hear the commitment and ambition of the government of Catalonia, because that's really a starting point. If all the other actors are fighting against the government that doesn't want to move, then things are very difficult to change. But when there's the potential of a partnership across lines, across institutional lines, then you really have the ingredients for moving forward quickly. Thank you very much. I'd like to now turn to Paul Sosona, partner of the Banking and Finance Department of Cuatro Casas. You are, I guess, from the legal profession.
Yes.
And so we've heard about finance and financial management, financial institutions. We've heard about government policy making and politics. Where do you see the legal profession coming in? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you're doing in this field of nature finance.
Okay, so yes, thank you for inviting me. Indeed, when I was approached by Barcelona Centre Financier, we believe that, well, it's the right place to be. Is talking about finance for sustainability. We have been involved in many finance deals where sustainability is key, and we have seen two different kinds of deals. We have the green loans, green bonds. We have discussed about that at some point. Those of which the purpose of the loan is aiming at contributing to environment, generally environment. Maybe we still don't see, we don't see yet so many biodiversity purpose loans, but we'll talk about that later, and we'll get there. And we also see as well some sustainability-linked loans, dozens of these, where the margin, the interest rate is dependent on whether the borrower is able to achieve certain KPIs and certain goals in that respect. But you asked us to focus particularly on biodiversity, and as a member of the ESG task force on the finance team in Cuatro Casas, I did some research, I did my homework, and truth is that maybe if we were asked this like 3 or 4 years ago, maybe we did not have almost anything to speak about, but fortunately nowadays we are seeing some increasingly interest in these kind of deals. Maybe not that many in Spain. We have offices across Europe and Latin America, and especially Latin America is much more active in this field, but we do have some examples I guess we're short of time, but we have some examples about reforestation, which aims at generating carbon credits, which the final goal is fighting against climate change, but along the way they reforest, they recover forests. So this is something that obviously contributes to biodiversity. And we have also seen several projects relating to almond and other vegetables and fruits and farming and all kind of projects relating to regenerative farming. However, after hearing you all, I think we, despite of having a pretty small number of deals currently in Spain, I think this is increasing, and I think we have a promising future. Hearing, especially listening to your appealing speech, and maybe I would like also to emphasize the way we could have these projects being financed. Maybe I would not be the right person. We have someone from Banco BBVA here, but we have some experience listening to our clients, different clients, and how can you finance these kind of projects. Any investor will look at the project from and look for two conditions: whether the project is safe and profitable. It will be safe if it has good collateral. It will be profitable if it has sustained and reliable cash flow. In these kind of projects we have seen, these are typically projects that the asset is a plot of land which has no uses other than the project itself. So if the project fails, unless it's about management of the project, which is not typically the case, if the project fails, then you have a plot of land that is very close to useless. So the collateral is not typically the best part of the equation here. Okay, so we need to focus on the cash flows, which is what we typically do in renewable energy, in project finance deals. So I think that the way to present this to potential investors and financiers would be to the same way we approach project finance deals in renewable energy, which is mainly providing a good base case and ensuring that we have a profitable project in the long term. And I don't think we discussed that earlier. I don't think we really need very high yield rates, very high profits, because there's an interest. There has been a very increasing interest in climate change projects, and there will be an interest in biodiversity. So that will top up the interest the investors need to invest in these kind of projects.
Thank you. Very interesting, and that's an experience that I think is shared with many other countries. That there are perception of risk attached to biodiversity-related projects or nature-related projects that are, in part, because there are risks there, but it's also in part because of lack of familiarity. And so perhaps the way to speed up the transition to a greater acceptance of nature-related projects is to work on the incentives, work on risk management mechanisms, work on risk-sharing mechanisms, like through public-private partnerships or blended finance mechanisms, or to find a way to manage the risks that are based on KPIs and incentives. So I think that the obstacles are real, but perhaps that simply means that we have to show a lot more creativity in how we come about those obstacles, because what it sounds like is that we all share the end objective. It's just that the means to get there have obstacles in the way. And so I think that we looked at some of the incentives provided by the European Union. We heard of the strategy and action plan and levers used by the government of Catalonia. If we can connect all these layers properly through the financial institutions, then we can probably do much more than we're doing now, and more quickly and more successfully. The last comment I'd make on your talk is that you quite rightly talk about how some of the best known ways of investing in nature are through climate action. So climate credits that are what we call climate plus, that address climate objectives through nature action. And I showed in one of my slides the fact that the greatest potential for carbon reduction in the atmosphere actually lies in the area of nature, agriculture, land use, and so on. So it's encouraging to hear that you're working also on that. In the interest of time, I think I'll go straight on to the last speaker, Jordi Bermudez Gutierrez. Roca, you introduce it. An associate of the Financial and Regulatory Department. What is your experience with trying to introduce nature into financial activity and investment?
Yeah, okay. Do you hear me? Okay. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, now better. Yeah. I completely agree with Paul. I mean, we have experience at Roca Junyent. We advise on a regular basis on the creation of investment funds, private equity funds, UVECA, USEF, corporate financing, M&A transactions. Some of these transactions sometimes their main focus is to provide funding to ESG-related projects, but even in that cases, I must admit that not the majority of them, do really tackle biodiversity loss. So I think that the issue here is that biodiversity finance is a kind of new phenomenon. Okay, so and that's why we have to work, public sector and the private sector in order to develop, and help this new phenomenon. In terms of the main challenges and opportunities that we may see regarding biodiversity finance, I would like to highlight the following. In terms of challenges, I think that one of the challenges is that we have to identify projects that may be viable, both from a financial and biodiversity point of view. In this regard, I think that as a consequence, that due to the fact that biodiversity is a new phenomenon, investing in biodiversity, we tend to see that these kind of projects, they are early stage projects, okay? So they entail some risks in terms of, for instance, use of technology, viability of the technology that is being used, or even viability of the business model that is being proposed. In addition to this, at least in our experience, the average investor is not used, as of today, to dealing with conservation or restoration biodiversity projects. And the institutional investor is not, I would say, comfortable in this kind of early stage projects, and it prefers to invest in a more mature project because it entails a more mature project. In principle, it will entail more assurances in terms of liquidity, in terms of access to standard documents, or in terms of warranties, as Paul was mentioning before. Another challenge will maybe the need to identify common metrics and data related to biodiversity projects. In this regard, I think that the main problem or issue that we have in the field of biodiversity, unlike what happens, for instance, in the climate change space, is that biodiversity is extremely difficult to measure. The value of biodiversity tends to depend on a multiplicity of factors, such as the local context. It's true that there are several indicators and methodologies to provide this kind of data and metrics, but there's no real consensus as of today on their use, on their common use. In this regard, I think that the task force on nature financial disclosure, it's a huge step in the right direction. Another challenge also related to metrics, from my point of view, would be to establish a kind of harmonized system to tracking, monitor, and reporting on financial flows, because this kind of systems, harmonized systems, would enable us to compare financial flows across countries. And why would this be necessary? Because otherwise we will not be able to quantify biodiversity loss. It will be much more difficult to quantify what's the funding, the required funding to close the financial gap, for instance. And if you put the focus on the investor, I think that this kind of harmonized systems may be positive for investors in the sense that they can provide some kind of assurance to the investor that the money that he is or she is investing is actually going to the place that he's been promised to. Okay? Another challenge in this case for governments, I would say, would be to try to change the policies in order to support by the investment in biodiversity-related projects. What I mean by this, if we see we take the experiences from the climate change space, we see that there are some countries such as UK or Switzerland, and Spain is in the process of doing that have already approved some laws in the sense that they have transformed what as of today are like voluntary market practices into real obligations, such as disclosure on climate-related risks. Okay, if we want to scale up finance flows, to biodiversity, and we need to speed up this process, I think it would be convenient for governments and public institutions, to pass this kind of laws. No? And the last challenge that I would like to highlight, in this case for financial institutions, would be to adapt to the new requirements in terms of putting biodiversity in the center of a strategic team making decisions. No? I think that this will be extremely challenging for them, time-consuming, costly in terms of resources that will be needed, but is a must. Is a must in the sense that biodiversity loss entails a lot of financial risks for financial entities. I'm thinking about credit risk, market risks, for instance, decline on the value of the investment portfolio, reputational risks, and for sure legal risk and regulatory risk. No? And just to conclude my presentation, I would like to briefly identify some opportunities that may be raised in this field, such as the potential generation of new financial products. For instance, products addressed to consumers to invest in pro-biodiversity projects, the potential generation of new markets, ecotourism, for instance, improvement of the relationship with clients, okay, and finally the potential generation of new revenue streams.
Thanks very much. Actually, what you've done is to lay out a whole program of work that's required. Listening to you, I thought, you could be a speaker from Norway, you could be a speaker from the United States, you could be a speaker from South Africa, and you'd be saying the same things. Because actually, broadly speaking, the challenges are the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're the same because we're talking about new market challenges. We're talking about emerging markets. We're talking about unfamiliar land. So if I try and summarize the advice you gave us, the first one, which you articulated towards the end, but strikes me as central, is that we have to have a shared overall goal. For me, the shared overall goal has to be a nature positive use of finance. So that all financial flows lead to equitable and nature positive outcomes, right? Yeah. I mean, that's where we need to get to. Now, can we do that by tomorrow? No, we can't, because it's not ready. It's pieces are not there. But we have to have a shared goal. And the way you put it was to make biodiversity central to financial operations, which I think is roughly the same thing. The second is that there's work to be done on the enabling framework. Policies are either inadequate, or they have too many loopholes, or they provide perverse incentives, or they're out of date, or they don't correspond to the needs of the financial sector. And we need to do a review, obviously largely in the public sector, but at the political level also, of the adequacy of our frameworks, and ask ourselves, are the incentives that are built into this system favoring a transition to nature responsible financial activity, or are they actually tripping it up or causing it to slow down? The third thing that you said, which I think you would hear in any country, is that we need a much more harmonized system. That we have bits and pieces, some of them quite well developed, others new, and so on, and that unless we have a kind of shared set of metrics, a shared set of definitions, a shared set of tools, or tools that deliver a fairly shared set of results, then it's going to be very difficult for us to move fast. The fourth is the the instruments, the methodologies, the tools that we actually have to enable us to do this. We may have the data, we may have the goal, we may have our objectives, we may have the rules and regulations, but the tools, like the alignment tool that I illustrated in my presentation, I think there's a lot of instrument development or tool development that's still required in this space. And fifth, but by no means last, what you pointed out is that we're at the beginning of the learning curve. And so my general impression from both these panels is that you're too apologetic. You're too inclined to say, well, we're just at the beginning of it. Everybody's at the beginning of this. And there's no way to get onto that learning curve fast than to experiment, to try, to fail, to learn from the experience and move up that and share experience and share common practice. Look for best practice, look for what's applicable here. And I think that if we take those 5 criteria, we have the makings of a program that will lead us from our sort of tentative attempts to build biodiversity into our management of the financial system to a point where we can reach a nature positive goal and that it will become a new requirement of doing business. And that's kind of my dream, and I hope that you all share it. With that, and because we ran over time, and if you would present our excuses to your colleague in Brussels about the technical glitch, I think his introduction was extremely useful in setting the frame for this discussion, but it would have been nice to interact with him a bit more. With that, maybe I can turn over again to Luis to conclude this session. Would you like us to stay here, or do you want us to? Okay. Thank you very much. If we have time, then I'd be happy to take questions.
Only for Felix.
The trouble is, I'm Swiss, so when it comes to the time.
Okay. Bueno, lo diré en castellano porque me entiende perfectamente. Otra cosa. Y lo de la ñ, el junyent, ya luego os lo explico. Oye, muchas gracias a todos, sobre todo a los panelistas. La verdad es que ha sido un placer teneros esta tarde. Creo que ha sido muy interesante la jornada. Y muchas gracias, sobre todo a ti, Marc, por estar hoy con nosotros. Ha sido un placer tenerte, te hemos estrujado mucho. Esta mañana he tenido reuniones con unas cuantas personas y la verdad es que ha estado muy interesante toda la jornada. Por eso darte las gracias por tu predisposición y por estar hoy con nosotros, que ha sido todo un lujo. I a vosaltres us diria que teniu la web del Barcelona Centre Financer a la vostra disposició, que entreu, que veieu les activitats que fem, que demaneu la newsletter que fem periòdicament, veureu totes les activitats i molta informació que pengem allà a la web, crec que molt interessant i que ens teniu a la vostra disposició. Muchas gracias y hasta pronto, Marc. Gracias.